Somewhere in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, around the year 1717, a man is sitting alone at the top of a wooden mast, 90 feet above the deck, 90 feet above the water, 90 feet above everything and everyone he knows. Below him, the crew is asleep. The ship rocks slowly in the dark, the hull groaning against the tide like something alive. There is no moon tonight. The stars are out, scattered across a sky so black it blends into the ocean at the horizon, and the man up top cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. He has been sitting in this barrel, this tiny wooden platform lashed to the highest point of the ship, for 6 hours. His legs are numb. His back aches against the mast. His eyes burn from staring into nothing, scanning the darkness for the faintest flicker of a distant lantern, the smallest interruption along the line where sky meets sea. If he sees something, he saves the ship. If he misses something, everyone dies. This is the lookout, and this was the loneliest job on a pirate ship. Now, if you pull out a map of the Caribbean during the golden age of piracy, roughly 1650 to 1730, what you see is a spider web. Trade routes crisscrossing from Havana to Cartagena, from Port Royal to the coast of Venezuela, from the sugar plantations of Barbados to the slave ports of West Africa and back again. Spanish treasure fleets moving gold from the New World to Seville. English merchant ships hauling tobacco and cotton across the Atlantic. Dutch traders running spices through the Lesser Antilles. French vessels carrying fur and timber from the northern colonies down through the Gulf. Every single one of those routes was a target. And the men who hunted those routes, the pirates, the buccaneers, the privateers gone rogue, they lived and died by one thing: information. Specifically, the ability to spot a sail on the horizon before that sail spotted them. That job fell to one person, the lookout. And nobody talks about him. We talk about the captain. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. We talk about the quartermaster, the bosun, the gunner, the surgeon. We romanticize the pirate life with swords and treasure and Jolly Rogers snapping in the wind. But the man sitting alone at the top of the mast, the man whose eyes were literally the difference between a prize ship and an ambush, between fortune and the gallows, that man has been almost entirely forgotten by history. So let's fix that. To understand the lookout, you first need to understand the ship he sat on top of. A typical pirate vessel during the Golden Age was a sloop or a brigantine, sometimes a captured merchant frigate if the crew had gotten lucky. The mainmast on a sloop stood anywhere from 60 to 80 feet tall. On a frigate, you could be looking at 90 to 100 feet. At the very top of that mast, or close to it, was a small platform called the crow's nest. Sometimes it was an actual barrel lashed to the mast with rope and iron bands. Sometimes it was just a few planks nailed together with a railing you would not trust your life to, except you had no choice, because your life, quite literally, depended on being up there. The crow's nest existed for one reason: height equals distance. If you are standing on the deck of a ship, your eyes are maybe 15 feet above the waterline. At that height, the visible horizon is roughly 4.5 miles away. That means you cannot see anything beyond 4.5 miles in any direction. But if you climb to the top of an 80-foot mast, your horizon extends to about 10.5 miles. On a clear day, you might spot a tall ship's mast from 12 or 13 miles out. That difference, those extra 6 or 7 miles of visibility, was everything. It was the difference between catching a merchant vessel off guard and sailing straight into the broadside of a Royal Navy warship. It was the difference between finding land before your water barrels ran dry and drifting past an island you never even knew was there. It was the difference between life and death. and that is not an exaggeration. So somebody had to be up there, always, day and night, calm seas and storms, blistering sun and freezing rain. Somebody had to be in the crow's nest, scanning the horizon in every direction, watching for sails, watching for land, watching for weather, watching for anything that moved or changed in the endless, featureless expanse of open ocean. And here is where the loneliness starts. The lookout shift on most pirate ships ran 4 hours. 4 hours alone, 90 feet in the air, with nothing but wind and sky and water, without conversation, without companionship, without distraction of any kind. The crew below might be gambling, drinking, repairing sails, cleaning weapons, arguing about the articles, sleeping in hammocks stacked 3 deep in the hold. The lookout heard none of it. The wind at the top of the mast was constant and loud, drowning out everything below. The only sounds were the creak of the rigging, the snap of canvas, and the low moan of the mast flexing under the pressure of the sails. 4 hours of that. Then another man climbed up to relieve you, and you climbed down on legs so stiff you could barely grip the ratlines. And then, depending on the size of the crew and how the watches were divided, you might be back up there again in 8 hours. Now consider what those 4 hours actually felt like. There was no entertainment, no book to read, because even if you could read, which most sailors in the early 1700s could not, there was no light at night, and the wind and spray would destroy any paper within minutes. There was no one to talk to. There was nothing to look at except the ocean, which from 90 feet up looks exactly the same in every direction for as far as you can see. The same gray-blue water, the same white-capped waves, the same flat, unbroken horizon line circling you like a wall. Modern psychology calls this sensory deprivation, and it does strange things to the human mind. When the brain receives the same unchanging input for hours, it starts to fill in the gaps. You see things that are not there, shadows on the water that look like ships, cloud formations that look like land, heat haze on a calm day that bends the horizon until you cannot tell if that dark shape 8 miles out is a Spanish galleon or a trick of the light. Experienced lookouts learned to deal with this. They developed habits. They would scan in a pattern, starting at the bow and sweeping slowly clockwise, then counterclockwise, then checking the wake behind the ship, then starting over. They would count waves. They would track the movement of clouds. They would watch the behavior of seabirds, because seabirds near open water often meant land was within 50 miles. A frigate bird, flying in a straight line at dusk, almost always pointed toward shore. A sudden appearance of gulls when you had not seen any in days meant something had changed. These were survival skills, and the good lookouts had them burned into instinct. But they were also coping mechanisms, ways to keep the mind engaged when every part of your body and brain was screaming at you that nothing was happening, nothing was going to happen, and you were completely and utterly alone at the top of the world. The physical toll was brutal. The crow's nest offered no shelter from the elements. In the Caribbean, daytime temperatures could reach 100 degrees or more, and the sun at the top of the mast was direct and unrelenting. There was no shade. The wood of the platform and the mast itself would get so hot it could blister skin. Sunburn was not a minor inconvenience for a lookout. It was an occupational hazard that could leave a man temporarily blind, peeling, feverish, and unable to perform his duty for days. At night, the temperature dropped, sometimes dramatically. The wind at the top of the mast was always colder and stronger than on deck. In the winter months, even in the Caribbean, a lookout working the midnight to 4 a.m. shift would be soaked in spray and shivering in wind that cut through whatever thin shirt or jacket he had. Hypothermia was a real risk on longer voyages into northern waters. Pirates who sailed the Atlantic coast up toward the Carolinas, Virginia, even Newfoundland, dealt with cold that could kill a man exposed at the top of a mast for 4 hours without proper clothing. And then there was the motion, A ship rocks in the waves, and that rocking is amplified the higher you go. On deck, a moderate swell might tilt the ship 5 or 10 degrees. At the top of the mast, that same swell translates into a swing of 15 or 20 feet in either direction. The lookout was essentially riding a slow, relentless pendulum, back and forth for 4 hours straight. Seasickness was common, even among experienced sailors. Vomiting from the crow's nest was not glamorous, and it was not rare. The men below learned to stay clear of the base of the mast during rough weather. But here is what made the job truly isolating. Beyond the physical hardship, beyond the boredom, beyond the sensory deprivation, it was the responsibility. The lookout was the ship's eyes. Every decision the captain made, where to sail, what to chase, what to avoid, when to run, when to fight, started with information that came from the lookout. If the lookout spotted a merchant ship early enough, the pirates could position themselves upwind, close the distance under full sail, and take the prize before the merchant crew even knew they were being hunted. If the lookout spotted a warship early enough, the pirates could change course, duck behind an island, drop anchor in a hidden cove, and wait until the danger passed. But if the lookout missed something, if he was too tired, too cold, too sun-blinded, too bored, too distracted by the hallucinations that came from staring at flat water for 4 hours, if he missed a sail on the horizon, even for 10 minutes, that could be enough. 10 minutes at sea can mean the difference between escape and capture, between freedom and a rope around your neck in Port Royal or London or Boston. And every lookout knew this. Every single one of them sat up in that barrel, knowing that if he failed, it would not just be his life, it would be the entire crew. 50, 60, sometimes 100 men whose lives depended on his ability to stay awake, stay focused, and see something before it saw them. That is a weight that is hard to comprehend, and he carried it alone. The tools available to a lookout were laughably primitive. The spyglass existed but was rare on pirate ships. Expensive, fragile, and coveted. Even when a lookout had one, the field of view was so narrow that he still had to scan the entire horizon with his naked eye first, spot something suspicious, and only then bring the glass up to confirm. In rough seas, holding a spyglass steady at the top of a swaying mast was nearly impossible. Most lookouts relied on nothing but their own vision, and not everyone could be a lookout. You needed specific qualities. Young eyes. First of all, visual acuity declines with age, and the men chosen for lookout duty were almost always the youngest members of the crew. Teenagers, boys in their late teens or early 20s, with sharp distance vision and the physical endurance to climb the rigging quickly and sit in an exposed position for hours. You also needed nerve. Not everyone could handle being 90 feet above a rolling deck with nothing but a few inches of wood between them and a fatal fall into the ocean. Vertigo was a real problem. Some sailors, hardened men who could fight with cutlasses and haul cannons across a pitching deck, simply could not function at the top of the mast. Their hands would freeze on the ratlines, their legs would lock up, their minds would go blank with fear. These men were not punished for it. They were simply never assigned lookout duty, and you needed a particular kind of temperament, the ability to endure long hours of tedium without losing focus, the discipline to keep scanning when every instinct told you nothing was out there, the psychological resilience to handle the isolation, the silence, the emptiness, and the crushing weight of responsibility hour after hour, day after day, for the duration of a voyage that might last months. Not many men had all of these qualities. The ones who did were quietly respected by the crew, even if they received no extra share of the plunder, even if their name never appeared in the ship's articles alongside the quartermaster or the gunner. The crew knew. They knew that the man in the crow's nest was the reason they were alive. There is a story, possibly part legend, about a lookout on Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge during the blockade of Charleston Harbor in 1718. Blackbeard had brought 4 ships into the mouth of the harbor, stopping every vessel that tried to enter or leave, demanding ransom and medical supplies. It was one of the most audacious acts of piracy in colonial history. During the blockade, which lasted about a week, Blackbeard needed constant intelligence on ship movements and any Royal Navy vessels approaching from the open ocean. The lookouts on his ships were working around the clock, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, in the brutal May heat of the Carolina coast. The story goes that one of Blackbeard's lookouts spotted the sails of a British warship approaching from the south, roughly 12 miles out, giving Blackbeard enough time to break the blockade, slip out of the harbor, and avoid a confrontation that would have likely destroyed his fleet. That lookout's name is not recorded, not in any account, not in any trial transcript, not in the dozens of books written about Blackbeard's blockade. He saved the fleet, and history forgot him. This was the pattern. Over and over again, across hundreds of pirate ships during the Golden Age, the lookout was the invisible man. He did the most critical job on the ship, and he did it in total isolation. And when it was over, nobody remembered he was there. Part of this invisibility was structural. Pirate ships were remarkably democratic organizations. The Articles of Agreement spelled out the rights and responsibilities of every crew member. The captain's authority, the quartermaster's plunder distribution, the surgeon's obligations, even compensation for injuries. Lose a right arm, 600 pieces of 8. Lose a left leg, 500. Lose an eye, 100. But the lookout, rarely mentioned. The articles almost never singled out the lookout as a distinct role with specific privileges or extra pay. There was never a bonus for spotting a prize ship, never an extra ration for working the midnight watch in freezing rain, never any recognition for the unique burden the job carried. This is partly because the lookout role rotated. Unlike the captain, quartermaster, or gunner, which were elected or appointed positions held by one person, lookout duty was shared among the younger, sharp-eyed members of the crew. On any given day, 3 or 4 different men might take turns in the crow's nest. This rotation meant that no single person owned the role, which meant no single person got credit for it, which meant the lookout as a concept was invisible in the social hierarchy of the ship. But the rotation did not make the job less lonely. If anything, it made it lonelier, because you were up there alone, doing the hardest job on the ship, and when you came down, you were just another sailor. You did not have the authority of the captain, the respect of the quartermaster, or the specialized knowledge of the surgeon. You were nobody. You just happened to be the one whose eyes kept everyone alive for the last 4 hours. The lookout performed a kind of emotional labor that has almost no modern equivalent. He had to manage his own fear, his own boredom, his own exhaustion, his own loneliness, all while maintaining hypervigilance that could not lapse for even a moment. He could not show weakness to the crew below, because weakness in a lookout was terrifying. If the men knew their lookout was struggling, morale collapsed. So he sat up there alone, and he dealt with it. Whatever it was on any given night: fear of the dark ocean, fear of the height, fear of missing something, fear of falling asleep, the crushing monotony of watching nothing happen for hours. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. The sudden spike of adrenaline when a shape appeared on the horizon, and he had to decide, in seconds, whether it was a cloud shadow, a whale, a rock, or a ship. And if it was a ship, he had to decide what kind: merchant or military, friend or enemy, prize or death. All of this, alone, in a barrel, in the dark, 90 feet above a crew of sleeping pirates who had no idea what he was going through. The physical dangers specific to the lookout went beyond weather and exposure. Falls were the most obvious risk. The ratlines, the rope ladders used to climb the mast, were made of hemp or manila rope that degraded in salt water and sun. A frayed ratline could snap under a man's weight without warning. The climb to the crow's nest on a calm day was strenuous but manageable. In rough seas, with the mast swaying and the ratlines slick with spray, it was genuinely dangerous. Men fell. Not often, but it happened. A fall from 90 feet onto a wooden deck was almost always fatal. A fall into the ocean at night, when the ship was moving and the crew was asleep, was equally fatal, because nobody would know you were gone until the next watch change, and by then, the ship would be miles away. Lightning was another hazard. The top of the mast was the highest point on the vessel, and in the Caribbean, where thunderstorms formed in minutes, the man in the crow's nest was the most likely person to be struck. Some crews pulled the lookout down during storms, others did not. The need for vigilance, when visibility dropped to nothing, often outweighed the risk of a lightning strike. Then there were the quieter miseries. Dehydration, because bringing a water jug up a rope ladder in rough seas was impractical. Eye strain from the constant glare of sun on water, which over time could cause permanent damage to a man's vision, ironically destroying the very ability that made him valuable in the first place. Some of the most experienced lookouts developed what sailors called sea eyes, a condition where the constant exposure to sunlight reflected off water caused the whites of the eyes to turn yellowish and the vision to develop a permanent slight blur at distance. A lookout with sea eyes was no longer useful in the crow's nest, and if he had no other valuable skills, his position on the ship became precarious. He had literally given his eyesight to the job, and the job had no pension plan. There is another dimension to the lookout's isolation that rarely gets discussed. On any pirate ship, the person who controlled information had power. The captain knew navigation. The quartermaster controlled the loot. The surgeon had medical knowledge. The lookout had a strange, temporary version of this power. For a few seconds, sometimes a few minutes, he was the only person on the ship who knew something critical. He was the only one who could see the sail on the horizon. He was the only one who knew whether it was coming toward them or moving away. He was the only one who could tell, from the shape and arrangement of the sails, whether it was a merchant brig or a Royal Navy frigate. In those seconds, he held the fate of the entire crew in his throat. One shout, and the ship erupted into action. 50 men scrambling to their stations, hauling anchors, adjusting sails, loading cannons, preparing for either a chase or a flight. The lookout's voice triggered all of it. His word was the starting gun, but the moment he shouted, the power was gone. The information passed to the captain, who made the decisions. The lookout went back to being invisible. He had delivered the message, and now he was just a pair of eyes again, watching from above while the real players below decided what to do with what he had seen. This cycle, being the most important person on the ship for 30 seconds, and then the least important for the next 4 hours, must have been psychologically exhausting. Research on intermittent stress shows that unpredictable bursts of high-stakes responsibility separated by long monotony are among the most damaging patterns for mental health. The body and mind never know when to relax and when to be alert. The lookout lived in this pattern for the entire voyage, and he could not talk about it. There was no one to talk to up in the crow's nest, and when he came down, the culture of the ship did not encourage emotional vulnerability. Pirate crews were tight-knit but rough. Weakness was dangerous. A man who admitted he was struggling with the psychological burden of lookout duty would likely be mocked, or worse, removed from the rotation and given menial tasks that carried even less respect. So the lookout kept it inside. He climbed the mast, did his shift, climbed down, ate his rations, slept in his hammock, and climbed back up again. Day after day, week after week, what did lookouts actually spot? The most common sighting was another ship, and the job was not just to see it, but to identify it. A merchant ship sat low in the water when loaded, sails configured for efficiency. A naval warship rode higher with more canvas and gun ports visible along the hull. A pirate ship was often a captured vessel modified for speed, hull painted dark for concealment at night. The lookout had to make these distinctions from 10 miles away with his naked eye. The angle of the bow wake, the way the sails were trimmed, the number of masts, the height of the hull above the waterline. He read these clues the way a tracker reads footprints in the dirt. He also watched for land, which was harder than it sounds. Many Caribbean islands and low-lying cays can be invisible until you are almost on top of them, and many a ship was wrecked on hidden reefs that the lookout never saw until it was too late. The approach to an unfamiliar island required the lookout to watch not just for the land itself, but for changes in the color of the water, which shifted from deep blue to lighter green as the seafloor rose toward the surface. He watched for breakers on distant reefs, visible as a faint white line on the horizon. He watched for the behavior of birds, the direction of currents, the smell of vegetation carried on the wind. At night, this became almost impossible. Without moonlight, the lookout was essentially blind. He relied on sound, the crash of surf on a nearby shore, the change in the pattern of waves as they reflected off a landmass, and on the faintest visual clues, a slightly darker shadow against the dark sky where an island blocked the stars, the distant flicker of a fire on shore. Night watches were the loneliest of all. 4 hours in total darkness, hearing nothing but wind and water, seeing nothing but stars, knowing that a reef or a sandbar or a hostile ship could be a mile away, and you would never know until it was too late. The night lookout's job was less about seeing and more about listening, feeling, sensing. It was almost meditative in its intensity, except that the stakes were real, and the consequences of failure were not spiritual, but very, very physical. Some pirates' crews developed a system for the night watch that was both practical and, in hindsight, strangely compassionate. The lookout on the midnight to 4 a.m. shift, the worst shift, would be allowed an extra ration of rum before climbing the mast. Not enough to impair his judgment, at least in theory, but enough to take the edge off the cold and the fear and the loneliness. This was one of the few concessions the ship's articles made to the unique hardship of lookout duty, and it was not universally practiced. Some captains, Bartholomew Roberts among them, banned alcohol entirely and expected their lookouts to endure the night watch's cold sober. Roberts, interestingly, was one of the few pirate captains who appears to have understood the importance of the lookout role. His articles specified strict punishments for any lookout who fell asleep on duty, including the loss of the offender's share of the next prize. This was a harsh penalty in a society where prize shares were the entire point of the enterprise, and it suggests that Roberts, at least, recognized that the lookout's attention was literally priceless. You cannot put a value on a pair of eyes that keeps you free. The fate of a lookout who failed was not always just financial. In the most extreme cases, a lookout who fell asleep and allowed the ship to be surprised by an enemy could face far worse than losing his share. The crew's response depended on the outcome. If the surprise resulted in a narrow escape, the lookout might be beaten, marooned, or put ashore at the next port. If the surprise resulted in casualties, the lookout might be killed by his own crewmates before the enemy even boarded. There is a recorded account from the trial of pirate crews captured in the early 1720s, where testimony describes a lookout being thrown from the mast by his own crew after he failed to spot a pursuing naval vessel until it was within cannon range. Whether this account is accurate or embellished for the court is impossible to know, but the fact that it was considered plausible enough to be entered into testimony tells us something about the expectations placed on the lookout and the consequences of failing to meet them. The end of the golden age of piracy did not come because pirates became less daring. It came because the navies got better at finding them. The Royal Navy expanded patrols. Colonial governors received funding to hunt pirates. And critically, naval ships had better lookouts, trained, disciplined, working in proper shifts with proper equipment. The pirate lookout, alone in his barrel, with his naked eye and his rum ration, was being outmatched by a professional system. By the 1730s, the great captains were dead. Blackbeard, 1718. Charles Vane, 1721. Bartholomew Roberts, 1722. Calico Jack Rackham, 1720. Their crews scattered, and the men who had sat in their crow's nests were forgotten entirely. But the job did not disappear. It evolved. Better telescopes, binoculars, rangefinders, formal training, and proper watch schedules. And then, in the 20th century, the lookout became obsolete entirely. Radar, sonar, satellite navigation. Machines replaced the human eye at the top of the mast, and the last lookouts were phased out quietly, replaced by screens and sensors that never got tired, never got lonely, and never fell asleep. But for 200 years, the lookout was the most important and most ignored person on any ship. And on a pirate ship, where the stakes were higher, the resources were fewer, and the consequences of failure were a noose, the lookout's job was not just lonely. It was a kind of invisible heroism. He climbed the mast, he sat in the dark, he watched the horizon. He kept his mouth shut about what it cost him. And when it was over, nobody wrote his name down. The oceans are still out there. The trade routes still run from coast to coast, just with container ships now instead of galleons. And somewhere in the history of every single one of those routes, there is a nameless teenager sitting at the top of a wooden mast, squinting into the sun, trying to decide if that shape on the horizon is a fortune or a funeral. He never got to find out what we thought of him. He never got to know that 300 years later, someone would finally tell his story. But here it is. The lookout. The loneliest job on a pirate ship. And maybe, in its own quiet way, the most important one